Welcome. This is the Taxpayer Talk show on Newton TV. I'm Dr. Randy Bach, and I'm with the Newton Taxpayers Association. And one of the things the taxpayers pay for is the City of Newton administration. Another is the public schools. And we'd like to know what we're getting. And to that end, I've invited on Dr. Steve Gerzof to talk about some of the aspects of things you might not know going on in your schools and within your city. And we're going to focus a little bit on the, you may have heard of this, there's apparently a little bit of a conflict going on in the Middle East, and some of the ways that sides have been taken within our school administration, teachers, and perspective. So, you know, how much of it is truth, how much of it is kind of push propaganda? We're going to try to uncover and unravel some of the sources of that. And try to put it in context of where Newton has been, why Newton is picked out and isolated and promoted for this, whether it's unique in Massachusetts, and so forth. Anyway, Dr. Steve Gerzof, tell us a little bit about yourself and what has brought you on to this particular quest.
Well, I'm a 50-year resident of Newton. Me and my wife have our kids and grandkids that have gone through the public school system. I've been here seemingly forever and want to bring the best to Newton when I travel. And in Florida, I happen to find this particular situation. If we could go to the first slide, it's a cattle car. I was invited to come down to Florida Atlantic University to see this particular cattle car, which is a replica of the cattle cars used to transport Jews during World War II and the Jewish Holocaust from the ghettos to the death camps. It was designed as an idea by a high school teenage girl as a replica of those cattle cars as a teaching aid, where it had audio-visual equipment in the ceiling and a safe inside haven to experience a 20-minute video audio presentation. It's thoroughly educational. It's designed not to be scary from inside. You can see the light outside, and I was invited to go inside and see this at Florida Atlantic University. As my wife and I went in, this is 4 or 5 years ago, we watched the students as if they were absolutely mesmerized. No one freaked out. They just stood there silently. And as we came out, my wife took my arm and said, "Steve, we've got to bring this to Newton." What I wrote about it afterwards was an observation as an educator teaching residents and kids who tend to be sleepy, particularly during internship. What I wrote was, no one laughed, no one cried, no one texted, no one tweeted, no one slept, no one slapped, no one jeered, no one joked, and no one was unaffected. And they left silently, solemnly, almost reverently from the experiencing the sound and light show of how the genocide of European Jewry happened. And the last line was from the diary of teenage Anne Frank to the young people of today, intoning the hopeful message, "Is it not wonderful that no one need wait a single moment before starting to improve the world?" I was so impressed with this because I myself come from a Holocaust survivor family. We decided to bring it to Newton. Later that summer, I spoke to then Mayor Fuller about bringing it to the high schools because it's designed for high schools and college students. It sets up at the college or at the high school. The kids come in. There are 2 docents, one to explain what they're going to see, one to decompress if necessary with some memorabilia, and it works very smoothly. I was referred to the Human Rights Commission in Newton. I wasn't sure why, but apparently anything Holocaust has to be referred through them in Newton. And so I appeared then by video to them, presented it, and they already came back with the idea that it would be great, but it would probably be at some location other than the schools. I was very surprised by that, and so I went back and forth with the then superintendent of schools, Kathleen Smith, not our present superintendent of schools, Anna Nolan, who is fabulous on this. But if we could have the slide of the letter she wrote to me said, "It is our wish in the Newton Public Schools, after conferring with school leadership and high school department heads, that the cattle car experience be at a neutral city city location where we can arrange to bring designated classes to experience this educational program. I was very confused by the term neutral. Now, this was not by the superintendent of schools. This was by high school department heads and school leadership. This was the inside of the school. And that really troubled me. What was it about them that they didn't think their schools were neutral for a program such as this?
Yeah, and it's a funny thing. You know, my kids read Dr. Seuss. I read Dr. Seuss to them when they were little. But before Dr. Seuss, he was Theodore Geisel. And I think he was a Dartmouth grad. And he wrote, he was cartooning back during World War II era. And he did all kinds of cartoons that were anti-Nazi. Charlie Chaplin did The Great Dictator, you know, anti-Nazi. I don't think there was anybody in disagreement that the Nazis were bad. And if you had, you know, the idea of putting an anti-Nazi exhibit up in a school in 1942, 1947, 1955, you wouldn't be saying, oh, we need to put that in a neutral place, because there might be some people who don't, you know, want to hear something that's anti-Nazi. The cattle car is against the Nazis, and it's talking about the Jewish Holocaust. Why do we need a neutral place to talk about the Holocaust? I mean, that just seems like an admission against interest to use that term.
It really bothered me, and I started thinking about it and then thought back to just a few years before. Newton parents had a lot of problems with the school committee just telling them what they were teaching. They refused to divulge the curriculum that they were using for the students. In fact, the Newton parents got together and had to file a FOIA, for a Freedom of Information request to get the answers. And I was aware of it at the time, but only peripherally until a year or two later, I stumbled into it myself. My next door neighbor was a student at Newton South High School, had just graduated, and was having a yard sale on her school books. And I found this one, for example, and bought it for $1. You can see it's the Palestine-Israel conflict, and it shows a presumably Israeli tank with its gun turret pointing at a well-dressed, good-looking young boy, probably Palestinian, with a rock in his hand. And
yeah, it's a David and Goliath story. In this case, the David is the Palestinian, the Arab boy, say. I mean, Palestinian is kind of a freighted term, you know, because Palestine was referring to the Israelis, you know,
yes,
for a long period of time. The Palestine National Orchestra, until you know, the turnover, was a bunch of Jews.
Until 1948.
Yeah, the coin of Palestine was written with Hebrew letters, but it's kind of an adoption term. And it's kind of interesting, the same kind of like cloaking is to flip the narrative of the genocide, to flip the narrative of David and Goliath. So David is not the Jewish kid fighting against the Goliath. I'm not sure if he was Gazan or whatever, but it's all about kind of like making the kind of small guy victim into the Arab and taking it away, uncloaking the Jew from that aspect. You know, that the Holocaust didn't exist, or if it did exist, they shouldn't have come to the Middle East. And if it is, they're doing genocide, doing the same thing and worse to the Gazans and the Palestinians, even though their numbers have gone up over time. It's a kind of a funny thing. It's an inversion concept.
Yeah, and with that in mind, I really took interest in this. As a professor of radiology, I've published a lot of stuff, and I started examining the books. I found that this one was written by an Iranian and a scholar of Rumi or Islamic philosophy. And when I looked in the back, a couple of key Islamic phrases about Jews didn't even appear. And there were only 3 references for Israel and 28 or so references for Palestine. So I thought, gee, if a kid was going to do a book report or a paper, which would you pick, Israel or Palestine? And similarly on this one, I found out that this book was written at the funding of Sheikh Zayed bin Sultan, who was the former president of the UAE, and that had similar problems. Specifically here, where it talked about the Hamas movement, which was not as bad then as it is now, but they talked about their charter, and they left out something specific. They said the theory of their charter is that Allah is its goal, the Prophet is its model, the Quran is its constitution, but what they took out was number 5. that death in the service of Islam is their highest virtue. This was talking about Hamas. And I later found out that when this was presented to the kids in school, they had also taken that out to sanitize it. Presumably, maybe not to get them upset, but really watering down the education. So it was more like a different philosophy of government.
No, you're right. I mean, I noticed a lot of stuff going on in the schools when my kids were there. They both went through the Newton Public Schools, and they're men now. But at one point they were talking about slavery, and slavery, they only focused, there was world history, they only focused on one type of slave trade. You know, the word slave actually first, comes from the same root word as the Slavic people in Eastern Europe, and they were clearly slaves. And there's no people on earth that at some point hasn't been enslaved by some other group. That's basically the way, groups pillaged, raped, conquered, and whatever, is to enslave the conquerees. And there's nothing unique about slavery. It's obviously the experience we have is the African slave trade by various Europeans and promoted by certain African tribes or whatever. But contemporaneously, even to this day, there's an Arab slave trade. And the only places, there are places where slaves exist to this day in Mauritania and throughout Northwest Africa, and probably surreptitiously in other places, which are, have indentured servant aspects of slavery. And there was nothing in those books that discussed kind of the universality of slavery, that it's a concept everywhere. They only focus in on certain aspects in the schools, and I don't think they give a complete education, and they pretty much are doing it in service, I think, I understand the reason why they discuss and concentrate on African slavery plantations in the United States. I get that. But they're not discussing on the fact that it happened in Brazil to a much larger extent here, and the fact that it kind of goes on to this day by, Arab slave traders, essentially. And the fact that the Arab slave trade was, enabling the African slave trade as well. There's just kind of like what you're calling a sanitization, where they, have sins of commission and they have sins of omission by like taking out certain parts of history that will give people perspective.
Yeah, specifically the religion of Islam allows for slavery. The word for slave in Arabic is abd. Allah is the Islamic God. Abdullah is a slave of Allah. The word for black is abid, which is black slaves from Africa, presumably. But I found it troubling that in this day and age, our students weren't learning this. Fast forward, I found another problem, in that the teachers themselves were getting miseducated. The most recent book on this 100 Years War in Palestine, which is actually recommended by the Newton Free Library last year when there was a little bit of a brouhaha. They had this recommended for further reading. It's by Rashid Khalidi, who is a professor at Columbia. He talks rather knowledgeably, as he should, because his uncle was one of the major principals and notable in the Arab Higher Committee at the time in Palestine, Israel in 1948, where he talked about partition. Now, after World War II, partition was used to separate peoples who the UN thought couldn't get along. They first used it in Southeast Asia, where there was this large subcontinent of India. They separated it for Muslims to be in the western portion, where Pakistan
and Eastern.
And Eastern, that's, yes, now Bangladesh. But India for Hindus and Pakistan for Pakistanis, for Muslims. Unfortunately, the human rights aspect of that didn't catch hold. Ali Jinnah, their first premier, when Pakistan was first formed and declared its independence from the British Mandate, gave a speech where everyone would be equal. That speech was not carried on the local stations, newspapers, or anything. And although Pakistan started off as 20% non-Muslim, today it's now down to only 2%. Meantime, there were huge massacres of separating the peoples. But that happened in August 15th of 1947. Only a few months later was the partition vote about the British mandate in Palestine to separate Palestine into two entities, an Arab state and a Jewish state. On May 15th, the Jewish state declared independence, not exactly from England, but at the end of the mandate, and so began the State of Israel. What happened on the other side really isn't dealt with in this book. If you read it, it says, after discussing knowledgeably partition, he says the provision for an Arab state in the 1947 partition resolution, parenthesis, albeit never implemented. We can show a sign of that. So if you're reading this, you just find out it was never implemented. It doesn't say the Arabs rejected it and called upon 5 of their neighboring armies to invade the nation Israel, right, and that the borders we saw, the green line, was just an armistice line. It has since been called a border, but it was not a border in the usual sense. It had never been negotiated. The Arabs refused to negotiate it, but that's what we had.
Yeah, so it's interesting. So you're bringing this book up because this book is being taught in the school. Is that what you're saying?
No, I'm just saying that this is a recent book that was recommended by the Newton Free Library. Anybody can buy it. This one is not recommended, to my knowledge. But if somebody wanted to follow the Newton Free Librarian's suggestion to read further about it, this would be a source of misinformation because it is so heavily weighted in a way that if you didn't know the history,
right,
I would, if all I knew was that, I'd be out protesting on the streets, right, for a free Palestine. It's just based on false history.
The librarian technically is a Newton employee, but I kind of would like to focus on the larger segment of Newton employees. And frankly, the biggest segment of the Newton budget is the Newton schools, and the Newton public schools. And I'm wondering whether, there's been recently kind of a push towards this, tilt towards the Arab point of view, the Muslim point of view, the Hamas, PLO point of view versus the Israeli point of view in our schools. And we saw it on bigger campuses as well throughout the region, Northeast, Harvard, MIT, Yale, Columbia, and so forth. I think it's kind of interesting and ironic, but perhaps not a coincidence, that those schools are the places of greatest protest. Those are the schools that have the largest percentage of Jewish students. The Jews remain a very small minority in the world. I think it's 0.2% of the world, and a small percentage in this area, but it's a larger percentage than you might find in, I don't know, Kansas or something like that, or Iowa. And I think you don't see the same protests at the University of Iowa as you see in the Northeast. So I think it's kind of a concentrated aspect. And I think Newton has been chosen for the same type of reason because that's where, they asked Willie Sutton why he robbed banks. It's like that's where the money is. And so I think there's a sense of going at the place where the Jews are to make them uncomfortable. And it has to be kind of a war, without boundaries. But insofar as that occurs, Newton, I guess, kind of opted out. To their credit, they opted out Absolutely. On the statewide endorsement of such programs and whatnot. I don't know if you want to speak to that a little bit for us.
Well, I don't want to seem unnecessarily to be complaining about the teachers because they are products of what has been going on. We've almost had what I might call kids for sale. When you look at the numbers, the staggering numbers of money that has been poured into the United States educational system by Qatar, by the UAE, all of these with a very pro-Islamic reason. If the teachers themselves go to get educated, they go on the internet. Back a few years ago, we found that they were in good faith, taking stuff off the internet, but it turns out it was Hamas propaganda. Unless the teacher is properly educated or prepared to understand this, they can't properly teach it. And I don't say it's their fault, but I don't think enough effort has gone into designing the curriculum to do that. As I understand it, it is the school committee that sets the curriculum, and most people, except for someone like myself who's retired and took a real interest in this, wouldn't have the time or effort. We need more professionalism in designing the curricula. And to your point, I commend the teachers immensely for standing up against that whole onslaught of teacher approval of some of these ethnic studies programs, which themselves are designed to basically pick on a philosophy of oppressor versus oppressed. And once you get into that, there's this kind of bipolarization of the world. You're either an oppressor or an oppressed. And when kids are freshmen and first get to school, they find out they're taught by classmates, by upperclassmen, you didn't even know this, but you are oppressed. And you have to find your degree of oppression to fit in with all of the other oppressed students.
Yeah. No, I know some young people and some recent graduates and contemporary high school students, and there were efforts. I mean, I call them struggle sessions. That's the Maoist era Cultural Revolution term of the same type of division. These are Marxian terms to have the, it's called critical theory and critical thinking. That sounds great. I mean, who wouldn't want to be, think critically, and who wouldn't want to, do critical theory because you want to examine things. But Marx actually used it as a continual revolution, so that you would be continually critical of all things around you, except of course themselves. And the idea, and it's a very old, concept to take power, is to have everyone divided amongst themselves. You're talking about India and Pakistan, whatever, the Raj. The British were able to take over, large parts of the world in a sense by having, factions work against each other. And this is kind of a theme that works to divide people. And I think this has happened within our schools. I mean, not that there were that many great things about the coronavirus episode, the lockdowns and whatnot, but one thing I think it presented to parents were the actual inside-out aspect of our school. So for the first time, people had their lessons on Zoom, and this was happening at home. And as a result, people got to see what was going on in the classrooms, and it was not, peaches and cream. I went to public school in New York City back in the Paleozoic era, and we were taught subjects. We weren't taught, I don't think, the propaganda that we have now. And we weren't pitted against each other. We weren't, put into groups artificially and told our ancestors had this responsibility or that, whatever, for somebody else. And this is what's happening, this whole kind of concept of reparations and whatnot. We are, being divided up based on immutable characteristics. And it's kind of racism to cure racism. And the concept is that some greater sin happened in the past that we're going to fix now by, making people suffer. And I don't think that's how things work out. I think people heal by healing, and they get better by getting better. I think, frankly, the man who probably can't be mentioned in our public schools, Donald Trump, had an excellent set of speeches in frankly, the Muslim world, in Riyadh, if I'm not mistaken, in Saudi Arabia. And he was talking about how there can be a win-win situation where people get together and they do better by each other and for each other through commerce and getting along. But one of the things not to be tolerated is terrorism, which is an affront he sees to God and a misinterpretation and so forth. I don't know if that's theologically true across all religions, but I feel as if the divisiveness is not helpful, and people don't necessarily see the perspective from each side. I think we're getting kind of a push towards kind of this underdog aspect, and I think it's an odd kind of underdog thing because if you look at the map, you kind of zoom out. Israel's this tiny little sliver on the eastern part of the Mediterranean, and you pointed out that there's like 0 non-Muslims in Pakistan. Well, there's basically the same thing happening all across the Arab and/or Islamic world. There's very close to 0% of non-Muslims in Syria today. That wasn't always the case. Lebanon was a Christian country till very recently, and becomes less and less so. This is a template that happens across many, many different places, and it's a religion of supremacy in a sense. And to buy into that, I think it's okay to present it, but I think oftentimes here what we're seeing is kind of a presentation and a bias. But I'm going to give you the last couple minutes to close up on this.
Well, that's getting a little further afield, but there is a huge philosophic difference between Western civilization and Islamic civilization. Islamic civilization basically started with one point in time with Muhammad. He was born in 570 AD, died in 632 AD, and in the just the very few, I think maybe 18 years of his prophethood, managed to create and convince a lot of people around him that the Jews were bad. He grew up in a Jewish environment. They did not accept his prophethood. And so all of his revelations and ultimately the Quran are focused on anti-Jewish sentiment. It became writ large as Islam succeeded in not so much reforming itself, but over time trying to reform itself to get back to the Salafi, the ancestor, the best point in Islam, which was the time of his life, or the Rashidun, the 4 caliphs after him. But as we get further and further away from that, because there is no one person who speaks for Islam, anyone can have his own interpretation of the Quran. And that's where certain leaders will arise who take a violent interpretation, get their votaries all hopped up on this violence, and attack whoever is not their brand of Muslim. We have the Shia-Sunni divide.
Right.
We have the Ahmadiyya of a variety of Islam, the Druze who are not accepted.
It's not like as if there are no wars outside of Israel, Palestine. And
Well,
mind you, the funny thing is they speak Arabic, and the Arabs, came from the Arabian Peninsula, which is not what Israel is. I mean, that Khalidi book, and Rashid Khalidi was one of Obama's advisors,
Yeah.
2007, 2008. Side note. Anyway, we're going to close up on this. Steve, how can people find out more about this, and maybe how can they reach you and learn?
They don't have to reach me. I'm not. I'm just a Newton resident. You can look up some of the legitimate sources. CAMERA, located here in Newton, CAMERA, Committee for Accuracy in Middle East Reporting and Analysis, or Stand With Us, or ZOA, a Zionist Organization of America, have pamphlets, booklets. There are lots of things you can look for if you try, but you won't necessarily find it on the mainstream because they're pushing their mainstream.
Well, thank you so much. We're the Newton Taxpayer Association. I would tell people to go look up Douglas Murray on X. And he's got some great pieces. I'm not going to have much more time to explain it, but why don't you check those out and follow us on Facebook at Newton Taxpayer Association. And even if you disagree with us, I think I'd like to hear from you. And thank you so much for joining us today.